In today's exercise, we're going to be doing a clay study of a skull. In my anatomy courses, generally students will start with a skull like this that swivels on this pipe here. This is a 1/2-inch pipe. You can get it at any hardware store. So what we're going to be doing first is trying to mimic this void, and we're going to do that by using some aluminum foil at first. So using this heavy-duty foil, I'm going to wrap this shaft and leaving the excess over the top, folding it over. I'm squeezing it so it can become rather solid. And then whichever side has more bulk, which is this side right here, I'm going to face that away from me, which will become the back of the skull. It seems about good, pretty solid. And most importantly, we'll be able to take this off and right back on as we see fit. To make sure that that's easier to do going forward, what we're going to do is cover this to get a nice hard base of clay that we can then build on. First, we want to check if we're in the right track here. Before we go onto the clay, I'm going to add a little bit more body. So you can see this from the side. I'm going to add a little bit more laterally. I'm not going to add any to the top, so I'm going to do that by folding over a little thin strip and then hugging it around, and then maybe catching the bulk of it in the back here. See right here? I'm just going to press this in instead of continuing to wrap it. So now if we placed it above, just capture a little bit more of this area. We're going to leave this area of the face as a void that we can basically produce in clay in total, because since it has so many divots and so many little details, we don't want to be hitting this foil as we sculpt. So leaving this blank is perfectly fine for right now. So I'm going to make sure that everything is nice and tight first. And then I'm going to take a little bit of clay. I'm going to be using the gray monster clay in this exercise. And I'm just going to wrap it. I'm not too concerned right now with form. Just getting it completely covered is my main goal here. Wherever I see quite a bit of foil, I'm just going to push it in a little bit and then covering it. So I'm going to cover this area here. And I'm almost there. And I'm going to extend the clay just slightly past where the foil was. And we'll see a little while later why I do that. It's essentially to create a lip that is the socket for when we take this off and on. Alright, that's about good there as a start. And the only thing that we're going to concern ourselves with right now, because since it's pretty let's call it pretty soft, right? So if we start working over here and we start grabbing it up here, see how we deform the clay pretty easily because it's still pretty hot. Right now we just want to build up a nice little bulk. You see all this bulk? I'm going to build the majority of it, and then we're going to let it cool. So I just added a little bit more of these, the back of the parietal bones and the occipital bone. So we want to just build this up a little bit here. And I'm going to focus on the center line at first, just to get the right amount of clay on there. Think of like adding a mohawk to the top of your sculpture, just to get the right amount of clay. It doesn't have to be a perfect, you know, like half scale like this is, but I'm going to try to get mine fairly close, just as a size practice. That way you can really use this to measure and, you know, cross-reference it if you have one of these, which if you're taking the anatomy course, you do have one of those. So that seems about good. I'm gonna check it. Seems like I got a little bit too much down here. Just getting it close. So I'm pretty happy with that. So with this being the goal to meet, I'm gonna try to leave that untouched and then bring some clay around it. I'm gonna do a cross section down the middle to capture this area here. So if I look at the back, got all this surface to build. So what we're doing right now is trying to capture this cross section, and then we can kind of blow it in by adding bigger pieces of clay. I think that might be good. And another way we can check, being really gentle because it's still pretty soft, we can take it off temporarily and then check it against the skull. It seems like I've got pretty good indication of these wide set parts of the parietal bones here. So being very gentle, this is that lip I was talking about. I would advise against removing it right now. And now I'm just gonna block in the difference, keeping in mind that these flare out even more along the top here. So I'm gonna add another cross section like this, like if you were looking at it from the back. Those parietal bones kind of flare out a little bit here. And now I'm gonna just piece in between them, trying not to flatten it out too much. I'm going to add this bottom area. And then because there's a lot of warm clay on here, we're going to step away for maybe even up to 30 minutes or so, just to make sure that this cools down altogether. You could also throw it in the fridge for a little while, but you never want it to be leaning on itself. So only if you can stick this whole thing in the fridge, I would go that route. Otherwise, just leave it out for a little bit and let it harden. So essentially what we wanted to add there was that cranial area. I'm gonna smooth this out very gently here before we let it dry. Sorry, before we let it harden. Remember that this clay does not dry. Alright, this seems to be pretty good for right now. Check it up against it. Seems okay. I mean, we could have added a little bit more here. Maybe I'll just reshape it a little bit. Where the vertex of the skull is about right here, at least on this individual. Seems to be all the way back here. It's the highest point. Now we're just going to let this cool for a little bit. Now that I've let it cool, this is pretty hard now. And this lip here is no longer just the foil, so it's very easy to just put right back on and work on it on here. Or I could work on it by hand without deforming the back as much. So now I'm going to refine this area here a little bit more. Looking at my sculpture here, it's just very vague. It's not really descriptive like this would be, right? So now we're going to refine this silhouette a little bit more. And give it a little bit more of that peak. And in this exercise, I'm just going to be using my fingers and then one of these tools. And I'll avoid using this as much as possible because this is just supposed to be a quick skull study. So we're just using this for the areas where our fingertips can't really get into. So we're not that concerned with detail. But I'm going to use this wooden tool as a little planer. I'm going to establish this area here. You may ask yourself, why am I putting more soft clay on now that I've let it harden? Well, this is a very small amount, so I'm not really deforming that large structure that we just put in. This is kind of doing like the secondary and even tertiary forms on top of that first block, and that block's not changing at all unless we carved into it. Essentially, that clay has become our armature. You see the shadow goes kind of like that here around the occipital bone and the parietal bones because of this high peak here, which I'm still missing. So I'm gonna try to add that almost as a little corner. And then this shadow, I'm gonna push this shadow up. You see how now I've got that going on here? And this is what this exercise is doing. It's not just solidifying your knowledge of the skull a little bit, so you create the thing that you are studying, but what you're looking at are these shadows and how they behave, and how when you manipulate the clay, the shadows behave the same way if you're just pulling them in various directions. So this, I'm going to mimic over here on this side. See this little point? Looks a little bit idealized at the moment, but that's okay. And sometimes, since it's kind of just a ball at this moment, we can put in a center line, just a very rough center line, even with just a little, like a wooden tool. A knife would be better, but for right now, I'm just gonna do a little mental note. That's the middle. So again, if we were doing this before when the whole thing was hot, we would probably be going all the way down to where the foil is, which obviously we don't want. Because we want to keep, this exercise is also about structure. We want things to stay structurally sound as we begin to describe, sculpturally speaking, the structure upon which all of our muscles rests. Notice how I went and I stopped right at that center line. Now that I'm pretty happy with where these little peaks are, I can start to add a little bit of the fullness that's on the bottom. As this comes out this way, this mastoid process here, kind of almost peaks. So off of right here, this triangle comes over. It's still in shadow, so I'm going to make sure that I don't overfill it. Then it comes to sort of a peak right here, and I'm going to leave that pretty vague for right now. You see, all of a sudden we're already trying, getting this shape here, which is looking pretty nice. I'm gonna add it on this side now. Maybe not so much clay. And then I'm gonna feather it into that shadow. So now, using an actual knife this time, I'm gonna really establish this midline. It sometimes helps to start down here where the middle of the pole is. That's more or less true zero for us. It's right down the middle. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's at least a reference line that we could draw on our sculpture. So I'm going to put these in. And notice that I'm not drawing the sutures. I am basically drawing how the shadows are behaving to make sure that these planes that we're putting in are following the logic of the main structures here. Later we can come in and indent the sutures, but those are just kind of sitting on top at the moment. We're going to put in a little notch here. we look here, it has a little bit more fullness right here. So we kind of want to add a little bit of fullness here and a little bit of fullness right here. And then a little bump on this end here. So right now we're just looking at how the shadows and the light is hitting. And as you pass your finger through the warm clay, when you face the clay towards the light, you'll get a highlight. So just be conscious of that. What you're doing is kind of changing the angles here so that there'll be light catches and shadow catches. See, this is like a light catch, but it's underneath. So we want all of these to be kind of facing down. See how they're all in shadow now? And then right at the end, this one faces towards us. And we have that little notch shape. See that little shadow? Little shadow's right there. It's a little large, so I'm just going to pinch it upward. That looks about good. I'm going to push it inward a little bit, because if we look at the profile, it goes down more inset. We had it about out here. So for right now, I'm pretty happy with the back there. I'm gonna add a little bit more volume right in here. And with that volume that I've added, even though the lines used to be here, I'm gonna start to draw in the boundary of the parietal lobes and the occipital bone. And these, I'm going to remove the lines but still retain that little surface break. So that'll go straight along the middle here. Breaks right here, breaks right there. Now as I come forward, I want to continue this break. It softens, but it's almost like this is a little cap right here. And then we're going to add that frontal bone right here. So we're going to do that by coming to the front where we can kind of see the lack of a forehead. And as we can see, there's already quite a bit more clay here than here, so I'm just going to add a little bit just to balance it out slightly, and I'm doing it along that edge. So that's a little bit more balanced. And now along here, see if you look at it from the front, this is kind of bulging outward. We're going to add the frontal bone with the frontal eminences here. I'm just gonna add 2 pieces of clay, and then using my thumb, I'm gonna throw the edge of it back. Then using my thumb, I'm just gonna make a very temporary little like brow ridge. It's very temporary. So don't worry about getting that right. It's just about establishing that, because it looks like we might drop it a little bit more. But for right now, it's just kind of creating this area here. Now we're going to focus on the top of the frontal bone. So now we're going to keep this vertical, and instead of flattening it out altogether, we're going to very slowly wrap it without flattening it entirely. Here's where I'm just going to add a little extension down here. And if we look at this, we want to put in this little boundary here for the temporal line. This temporal line is going to basically do this for us on either side. But right now it's still pretty narrow on the front. Something we can do is I'm going to narrow the back slightly by just taking away a little bit of clay. It's a little extreme back there. And this is why these angles that we've created are useful. You can shave along them just to generally change your shape. And this is also why it's nice to have a little bit of soft clay on top of really hard clay, because as you're pulling this across, the hard clay underneath is keeping its spot. So we're reducing those parietals just slightly. Okay. Now when we look at it from the front, it's still relatively narrow. We want to add the superciliary arches, this area that goes into the zygomatic here. So we're going to add some triangles coming out this way. I'm going to let that float slightly. Now, I'm going to add the glabellar area that also features the superciliary arches, which are this kind of brow ridge here. I'm going to exaggerate them a little bit. It's almost like adding a large thick eyebrow over the top there. And doing the same on this side. And then the glabella. And then I'm going to pinch a little bit of clay here for this upper area of the orbital cavity. Now you're starting to look a little bit more like the orbits begin there. But we still lack a little bit of this like frontal large forehead that our subject has here, so I'm going to add a little bit more volume up here. And notice that I'm doing this bilaterally. I'm also using both my hands, which is a good habit to form now. It's a lot harder to implement. Let's say you start sculpting and you sculpt for 5 years, but you rarely use your left hand. It'll be a lot harder to get your left hand to kind of join the fold later. So just get into the habit of using your hand on either side of the subject. Kind of mirroring, just doing the same movements with both hands. Alright, now we're going to add this maxillary area, which is all this, including the nasal bones. We're going to essentially start by adding a little triangle right here. And notice how the triangle already kind of features the nasal opening. Then I'm going to do the zygomatic bone here. Basically a little piece that wraps around here. And then later we'll connect it back here. Again, using my left hand, even if it's slightly less dominant, as I am right-handed, but it's just a better habit to form, because then you can work on both sides at the same time, and it helps with symmetry. Now, gonna add the maxilla area, where basically it's the bony area that attaches to your teeth. Boom, just like that. And I actually want to add a little bit more cheek right in here. So you can see that this bulges out slightly. You see how this isn't as pronounced as it is here? See how far out it comes out? So we want to add kind of like what I added right here on this side. I'm just going to tidy this in here instead of sticking my pinky in there or something. I'm just going to use the end of this tool just to bring out the spine, the nasal spine. Now we're just going to blow in a structure that later we can edit that will essentially just be the entire lower area, which is the mandible. So I'm just going to add a piece of clay. It's a little thicker than it would otherwise be, but we want it to grab this bottom area here, so it's not just floating, it'll be subject to breakage. So as you can see, just me putting that, it already kind of looks like the mandible. Just gonna squeeze it, kind of like right here, just squeeze, squeeze. Then you have the ventral protuberance here. You can worry about the teeth later. It's not that important. Now I just have a very weak ramus, a very incomplete ramus here. So where we put our partial mastoid process, I'm going to develop it a little bit more. So I'm going to add it finally in there. Seems about good. Little ear hole here. Then above the ear hole, I'm going to connect our zygomatic to the temporal bone, which forms the zygomatic arch. And I'm just going to connect it. I know that it's supposed to be floating, but this is just a clay exercise. Remember, it's just about familiarizing yourself with landmarks and to study the shadows and lights of the skull. Later, once this hardens, you can go in there and just blow it out, and it'll stay. Monster clay is pretty sturdy. So now that we've established this area here, you can put the condyle and the coronoid process. With condyle, I'll just do like a little, almost cartoon kind of bone. And just let it sit in there. And then sometimes with the clay that's already there, if you can just edit it around, I'm going to add this notch here. The little notch that you see right in here. Everyone's is a little different. And then on top here, I'm going to add that coronoid process. And later, once this cools, we can refine it a little more. We'll angle the mandible here. Make sure you give it, the structure that it has. And remember that the teeth sit kind of like on the inside here, and then the ramus, which is this general blade here, the ramus and the coronoid process sit further out than the teeth area. So what I'm doing now is just kind of pushing the area that would otherwise be teeth in further back. I'm going to put in the zygomatic arch on this side. Coronoid process. And just like that, with some well-placed, well-considered pieces of clay, you essentially have all of the structures of the skull blocked in. So now I'm going to just start refining some of these shapes. Can really develop the inside edge of the orbits. So I'm going to do that now. Essentially, I just want you to take it about this far, because this will be a good little base for you to do portraits on this. So essentially, you'll never really fully recycle this clay, because this as an armature is very helpful for when you're doing portrait sketches. So from right here, I can take some warm clay and then just really start a portrait of some sort, and then knock it back to this stage and then do another portrait, which we will be doing. And that's about it. And you can refine this as much as you want. So if I were to take some clay and just continue to really pay attention to the shadows and the lights and how they're hitting. So if I want to really bring out those highlights there, I could do that and make as nice a skull as I personally want. But remember that this is an exercise, and taking it this far is already quite a bit of an exercise. So take it about this far, and then don't destroy it. Take pictures of it, and then we're going to do our other assignments on this same model.